fat normally has absolutely critical functions in the body. Besides being a cushion, it's actually a space heater, and it can actually burn down fuel when we want it to. So fat can actually burn down fat when it's called into action. We'll talk about that. But the other thing that fat does is it's an organ. It's an organ like your heart, your lungs, your spleen, and that's an amazing thing because it's not just any organ. It's an endocrine organ, which means that it secretes hormones. More than 15 different hormones that fat has been discovered to secrete. And these hormones that normal healthy fat secretes are critical to run your metabolism so you have enough energy at all times.
In this podcast, I'm speaking with Dr. William Li, who is an internationally renowned physician, scientist, and author of the New York Times bestseller, Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself. His groundbreaking work has led to the development of more than 30 new medical treatments and impacts care for more than 70 diseases, including cancer, diabetes, blindness, heart disease, and obesity. His TED Talk, which I watched more than a decade ago and shared with my family because I was so impressed with it, was called Can We Eat to Starve Cancer? And it's garnered more than 11 million views since it came out. He's appeared on Good Morning America, CNN, CNBC, Rachel Ray, Live with Kelly and Ryan, and a long list of other TV and radio appearances. He's been featured in USA Today, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and O Magazine. He is president and medical director of the Angiogenesis Foundation and has also been conducting research on COVID-19 in recent years. His newest book, which is the subject of our podcast and our conversation today, is called Eat to Beat Your Diet, Burn Fat, Heal Your Metabolism, and Live Longer. And that book is coming out on March 21st. This is a wide-ranging conversation. At first, we talk about his previous work and the subject of his TED Talk around eating to beat your diet. Can we eat to starve cancer? And we talk about some of the specifics of that work, and including some widespread myths and pervasive misinformation that's been around for many years that I think you'll find very insightful. And then we get into his new book, which is coming out in March, Eat to Beat Your Diet, and which is really focused on optimizing your metabolic health and losing body fat. So enjoy this conversation with the brilliant Dr. William Li. So welcome to the show, Dr. Li.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I watched your TED Talk many years ago on food, nutrients, and cancer, and I was fascinated with it. I remember sharing it with my parents, very excited to share this information with them many years ago. How many years ago was that you did that talk?
Oof, that was a 2010 TED Talk.
Yeah,
and
it seems like a long time ago.
And there's been so much more research been done so far, but it's actually had some long legs. People are still watching it for the first time, and I'm getting a lot of feedback on it.
Yeah, I'm obviously interested in talking to you about your new book, but since you just mentioned that there's some new research in that area, would you mind if we delve into that topic a bit before we get into the new book? Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, if people haven't seen that TED Talk, can you give people an overview of what you talked about? And then I'd like to maybe layer on the new piece that you're referring to.
Well, look, I'm a physician, internal medicine, and I'm also a vascular biologist. So I'm a scientist trained in the lab, and I study blood vessels. And one of the things that we have been long setting out to do is to figure out, is there a better way, a powerful way that we could help to control cancer and even prevent cancer by cutting off his blood supply? So you're kind of choking a cancer, starving a cancer. And I was involved with a research lab at Harvard in Boston that chased this idea for decades. And finally, in 2023, the first treatments that were based on preventing tumors from growing up blood supplies, so therefore there was no nutrients and no oxygen getting to the tumor, actually it was proven to be successful for colorectal cancer. And that exploded into this renaissance in biotechnology, looking at ways to control blood vessel growth. So that's the process called angiogenesis. And I run the Angiogenesis Foundation. We've been involved with every single medicine that's been developed in this field. Stop blood vessels for cancer, over a dozen new treatments. Stop blood vessels from causing blindness in diabetes and in aging. We've been involved with that. There's a brand new treatment that is extremely powerful in a beneficial way to save vision that just came out last year that we've been involved with. And then to grow blood vessels where you want them so that your critical organs and tissues have enough blood flow when they don't have enough, whether it's a heart or brain, spinal cord, or in the case of diabetes, a wound that doesn't heal. And so I was invited to give a TED talk about this whole idea of disease common denominators. I think that was probably the idea that really tickled their fancy. That instead of looking at everything that is different about diseases, which is what medical research does, my approach has been to so-called drain the Pacific Ocean, so you can kind of see how the islands are connected, and blood vessels is a connection. So I talked about how the revolution in cancer research was really to recognize the seminal role of blood vessels or angiogenesis, and that the successful realization that you can cut off the blood supply to tumors led to not only human cancer treatments, but to animal cancer treatments, pet dogs as well. So it actually spread across species. And then I showed some of our really wild experimental work, like, it's the same process feeding cancers in dogs. What about other animals? And then because drugs actually work, we asked the question, what about food? Maybe foods can do the same thing. So we use the same system for drug development to test food as medicine. And what I discovered in that I talked about in my TED talk was all these foods, more than 300 foods that can actually do this. So I presented all the data. It was very exciting. It kind of, I think, validated people's hunch that foods could be really quite powerful. And here's a biological way that it actually works. It fits with the drug model, except that foods are inexpensive and they don't have the side effects, and it's a more equitable solution. And foods taste great as well. So I'm somebody that really likes to cook, and I have a huge amount of respect for food culture. So I wrote a book called Eat to Beat Disease that really talked about the latest groundbreaking work to show that you could eat foods that would not only be helpful to starve cancer, but also could prevent vision loss, could grow blood vessels to heal your wounds. And so this idea of dietary angiogenesis control to prevent disease, to treat disease, to facilitate recovery has really taken off. We've discovered more recently than a TED talk that dark chocolate actually is very powerful for anti-angiogenesis. And in fact, we actually found which kinds of dark chocolate are actually even more powerful. So we began looking at varietals, which type of wine, which kind of chocolate, what kind of pears. I mean, we really just kind of broke it down. And now I actually co-chair a food as medicine working group that at Tufts University. So we're seeing, what I'm excited by is seeing that it's not just the idea of food as medicine appealing to a bunch of researchers or people selling supplements on the internet, but literally there is a frontier that's opening up for innovation. And because that's what I'm always about, like, how do we use science to break into, to be a path breaker to help our fellow mankind, with something as simple as food. There's so many discoveries in that realm that I think that one of the very, very exciting areas is going to be looking at neurodegeneration. How do we actually live longer and age better and support blood flow in our brain? That's so it's not just about starving cancers. It's also about how do we nurture our organs as we age.
I have a couple of detailed questions on this topic, if you don't mind indulging me. One,
sure.
If I remember correctly, and this is 13 years ago, but I remember, I think genistein, one of the phytochemicals that is in soy, as
Hmm.
being one of the most powerful anti-angiogenic factors that you discovered. Is
That-
that correct? Am I
yeah,
misremembering?
that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. In fact, the entire idea of dietary angiogenesis intervention actually came from studying the urine of Japanese farmers who
Mm,
lived outside of Kyoto and looking for bioactivity, looking for some signal that there was something that might be in their urine that could interfere with the blood supply of cancers. And it turns out all these farmers were vegetarians in
mm.
Japan. And when you picked out the spike in their urine, the chemical signal, a spike that in a lab you could pick out and identify that spike, it was genistein, which is this phytoestrogen. So quite the opposite to the idea that phytoestrogens in foods like soy could be harmful or dangerous for women who want to avoid breast cancer. Turns out the
And
complete opposite is true.
and that's what I was going to ask you, is that there's so much culture that has been built up for the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, of people who have demonized soy and taught that soy is bad, soy is going to increase your chance of cancer, soy is for men going to make you more estrogenic and be feminizing, and is generally an unhealthy food that should be avoided. Um, what would you say to people who are under that impression?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, first of all, it's an urban legend, and the science says the complete opposite. If you're a woman and you eat more soy, the studies show that your risk of breast cancer is decreased. The same thing as for men, you don't actually have decreased virility because of soy, but there's a reason why, and I think the reason why is what people need to know. So, first of all, like many popular beliefs about food and health, especially when it comes to demonization. I always say, well-intentioned person makes some uh, understandable connections. Let's look at this, like soy. Soy has a phytoestrogen, plant estrogen. Some human breast cancers are fueled by human estrogen. So wouldn't it make sense that eating soy would be dangerous because of the phytoestrogen could actually mimic human estrogen and cause a problem? To a layperson, a well-intentioned layperson, that would be a logical conclusion. However, as a scientist, which is what I am, we dive really deep into this, and so I like to explain some why this is actually an urban legend. Number one is that when you look at the chemical structure of phytoestrogen for genistein in soy, like chemical structure, it looks nothing like human estrogen, which you can look at the chemical structure. So, on the basis of science, you can look at these chemical structures and say they look nothing like the same, even though they
Meaning,
have the same.
like, for people who are not familiar with physiology, the implication being that it's not likely to interact with our estrogen receptors and promote the same functions.
That's correct. In fact, not only does it not mimic and cause the same function, the plant estrogen, as human estrogen, in fact, the plant estrogen from soy, genistein, blocks human estrogen. It's Mother Nature's tamoxifen, which is a drug that oncologists actually give women to treat breast cancer. And, and plus, genistein is cancer starving, it's anti androgenic. Plus, if you take a look at the large scale human studies. So there was a study of 5,000 women called the Shanghai Women's Breast Cancer Study that studied the women who are at the highest risk of breast cancer from soy, they would be, which is women already with breast cancer. All
Mm-hmm.
right. It turned out that when they actually studied soy consumption in women with breast cancer, those women who drank or consumed the highest amount of soy, which is about 10 grams per day. How much is in 10 grams per day? It's the amount of soy protein, including phytoestrogen, that you would get in a tall glass of soy milk. All right. 10 grams of soy protein decrease the risk of death from breast cancer by 30%.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And then if you had surgery or you were in remission, it actually decreased the chances of actually recurrence of breast cancer by about 30% as well. So, that's a large study, 3,000 people. And if you go to Asia, women there also are diagnosed with breast cancer. Unlike here in the West, where this urban legend has actually been widely circulating, as you point out. In Asia, women with breast cancer are not told to eat less soy; they're told to eat more soy.
Oh,
So
wow.
again, there's sort of this cultural relativism, right? So one thing that would have been logical to do 20 years ago when this rumor came out is like, well, so in Asia, when women get breast cancer, develop breast cancer, do they tell them not to eat soy? And those that do eat soy, do they develop a worse outcome? And the answer to both of those questions is no.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I have one more question about angiogenesis. We'll move on to your new book.
Sure.
And this might be a complex one, so feel free to oversimplify just for the sake of brevity. There is this desire to use compounds that have this anti-angiogenic function to block the formation of new blood vessels, because the cancer tumor is basically creating it's secreting compounds that stimulate the production of more blood vessels for it to feed itself as it's growing. So you're using these nutrients that are to some extent blocking that. And yet there are other things, I think most notably exercise, that create a pro-angiogenic effect and yet don't stimulate cancer growth, and in fact are anti-cancer. So how do we make sense of that seeming paradox?
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so the answer lies into understanding your own angiogenesis system. So, blood vessels in our body are perfectly natural, perfectly healthy, and we need to have them. In fact, they're one of our body's health defense systems, which is what I wrote about my first book, Eat to Beat Disease. And it turns out that our body manages this health defense system to make sure that all of our organs and cells have enough blood flow at all times. And if there are areas that don't have enough blood flow, it will grow blood vessels right in that little spot in order to be able to make sure that our tissues are adequately nourished. At the same time, it is on guard for excess blood vessels, like a tumor might want to actually grow. So think about it. On one hand, a gardener that is able to throw some seed down when there needs new grass in the turf. And on the other hand, the same gardener, which is our angiogenesis health defense system, has a lawnmower. So when the lawn grows too tall, basically it's mowed down back to that perfect level. So our system is in a state of balance at all times, where there's some fluctuation from day to day, week to week, month to month. But at the end of the day, there's never too many and there's never too few. There's always just the right amount. It's called the Goldilocks zone, like the three bears and Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Just right is a bandwidth. Okay. Another way to think about it is like the volume in your car radio, or your AirPods. When there's not enough, the volume's too low. You want to turn it up, and you could tolerate it, turn it up a little bit further, and you're okay. But you go beyond that threshold, like you can't stand it. Same deal with angiogenesis. Our body's able to grow just the right amount and also mow down, naturally suppress excess blood vessels. So when we actually eat foods that starve cancer of a blood supply, all it can do is to mow the lawn. All it does is it prunes off that extra level of blood vessels. Foods are not drugs. They're not powerful enough to punch through our defenses. So you can never cause somebody a heart attack by getting rid of their blood vessels when you're treating cancer using the dietary approach. Same deal. When you actually want to grow blood vessels in order to nurture your body, you can eat foods with them, and exercise will also do the same thing, by the way. But it will never overgrow, because guess what? The dude with the lawnmower is always waiting to mow down anything extra, and that's how the system works. It's like maintaining maintaining a golf course. It always looks great.
So in a way, where the goal is to support the body's natural regulatory system for both angiogenic and anti-angiogenic functions. Is that correct?
That's right. Exactly. And really what you're doing is supporting the underlying engine for this health defense together. If a little bit of this, a little bit of that, it all works together to make your system, your health defense system, so much stronger.
Wonderful. Okay, let's switch gears to your new book. So your last book was Eat to Beat Disease. The new book is Eat to Beat Your Diet. So tell me what prompted this. What is the book about?
Okay. This is a direct sequel to my first book, Eat to Beat Disease. in which I talk about your body's health defenses like angiogenesis, stem cells, your gut microbiome, gut health, your DNA repair mechanisms, and epigenetics, as well as your immune system. So there's 5 health defense systems, and all the foods, more than 300 foods that can actually activate them. So you really fields raised, right, against disease by working on your body. So this is never about deprivation. It's really about how to activation. And this is the sequel that describes where do you go from here? How do you get to that next level of health? And it turns out that once you have actually figured out how to overall eat generally healthier, to raise your shields, your immune system, your telomeres, protect them from cellular aging, and your better gut health, foster regeneration in your body, and make sure all your tissues have good blood flow. The next frontier that matters to everyone is to improve and optimize your metabolism. And it turns out all 5 health defense systems, including angiogenesis, are tied to your metabolism. And most people think they understand metabolism, but as it turns out, even scientists, until about 2 years ago, had largely the wrong idea. So within the last couple of years, and this is what I write about in my book, what is the new science of the metabolism? How does that connect with something that we usually attach to metabolism, which is body fat, body weight? All right. And then are there foods that we know that there's foods you shouldn't be eating if you don't want to gain weight, but are there foods that you should be eating to be able to help fight body fat and also to improve your metabolism? So this book delivers on all that, and it gives it to you in a really practical plan, but it takes you on this journey, including a tour through the supermarket that I write about. So you can, it's like you sitting in my shopping cart, and I wheel you around the entire supermarket, telling you what to put in the cart that can actually boost your metabolism.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's do this. First of all, let's define what is meant by metabolism, because the actual definition is basically the totality of all the biochemical reactions occurring in our body. Yet, as you pointed out, most people associate this word to mean resting metabolic rate, which is a function of essentially how much energy, how many calories our body is burning per day at rest. So what do you mean by metabolism? How do you define it?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I don't define it as a scientist any differently than you described it, but I do explain it differently because the new science that helps us understand metabolism and body fat can be understood in a way that's much easier. Most people, are not comfortable. It doesn't register like, well, what does the sum of chemical reactions actually mean in the body? But here, I'll tell you a simple way for your viewers and listeners to understand metabolism. Our metabolism is how our body uses energy to fuel up and drive around our needs as we go through the day, whether we're listening to a podcast, whether racing to the airport, or whether we're sleeping at night. And that's what metabolism is. It's how our body uses energy. Very similar to when we sit in a car and we're driving our car. Our car uses fuel, energy to run its engine so we can get from point A to point B. And we don't think too much about that process. I mean, people who are mechanics know a lot about it. Car geeks know a lot about it. But most people just get in a car and they drive and take it for granted that, there's a system in place to actually make sure there's enough energy to run the engine. Now, what do we do in the car, driving a car? We take a look at our fuel gauge every now and then. And when our fuel gauge runs low, what do? We pull over to the filling station, right? And we know we got to take the nozzle out and put it into the gas tank, press it and fill it up. And then when it's filled up, it'll click. And then we put it back and we drive off and we're good, right? Well, actually, our metabolism runs our body, the engine of our body, in very similar ways. So our brain can register when our fuel tank is low. So when I say fuel to run the body's energy, our fuel comes from food. Food that we eat gives us the fuel. That fuel gives us the energy. Now, people call the fuel and the energy units calories, but I don't want people to focus on calories in, calories out, and counting calories. I think that's become really confusing and a little bit more of a cult-like kind of fixation for a lot of people. And actually, it's not a healthy way to think about it. I prefer people to think about Look, you know when your body knows when your fuel is running low. What do? You don't pull over to the filling station. When your fuel is low, you pull over to the dinner table or to the refrigerator or to a restaurant, so you can eat some food and load up on your fuel. Now, here's where metabolism connects up with body fat. All right. Most people think, oh, if I'm eating, I'm going to get fat. I'm going to gain weight, and that's like how I get fat. Not so fast, Roger Kaputnik. There's actually a connection to this. You need to understand how this normally works in a healthy way. Our body fat's incredibly healthy. So I'm going to bring us back to when you were still in your mom's womb. When your mom's egg met your dad's sperm and they turned into a ball of cells that would be the future you, one of the first tissues that form is your circulation, angiogenesis. And that's because every organ in your body will ultimately need to have a blood supply. The second tissue that forms are nerves. And that's because every organ needs instructions to be sent through this electrical cable that actually tells them what to do. The third tissue that forms is body fat in the womb. So tiny little fat cells form as a third tissue in your body, and they form around your blood vessels. It's like bubble wrapped around your blood vessels. Now, why is that? It's because fat cells, the cells that make up fatty tissue, actually are fuel tanks. Go back to the fuel analogy. And what happens is that when fuel is through food is in your bloodstream, your body packs the fuel from the bloodstream right into the fuel tank, just like you put the nozzle from the filling station into your gas tank. That simple. All right. That's why there's a lot of blood vessels. So you had body fat. Okay. Even before you had a face, you could stuff with food. And fast forward 9 months. All right. When you see a healthy baby, what is a healthy baby? It's a fat, chubby baby with, chubby cheeks, chubby arms and legs. I mean, their arms look like they were the circus animals twisted by a clown, right? I mean, and that's healthy. We know that fat is associated with health. It makes us feel good, and we know a healthy baby is chubby. In fact, if you saw a baby that looked like a fashion model on a runway, chiseled cheekbones, long thin arms, long thin thighs, legs, you would be freaked out. You'd say there's something seriously wrong with this baby, right? And you'd be right. Okay. And so this idea that we associate body fat with something terrible and undesirable is completely wrong. Our body fat is our fuel tank. So
sorry, just when you say completely wrong, so would you object to the idea that my impression is quite well established among metabolic health researchers, that when you have too much body fat, it becomes extremely deleterious to health and drives insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and overall metabolic dysfunction?
That is completely correct. And I'm in complete agreement with that. What I'm saying about our idea that we only think about fat in reference to when it's in excess, and therefore it must be something that you want to get rid of.
Right.
That is actually overlooking, and therefore wrong, overlooking what its natural normal function is, which is the fuel tank. And it loads up on the fuel that our body needs to drive our carcasses around to be able to do the things that we enjoy to make our life meaningful. So what's really interesting when you think about metabolism, it's that process. Now, I'm gonna go right to what you talked about, excess body fat. Okay, so why do some people develop excess body fat? Well, think about it. If you actually were in your car at the filling station, filling up the gas, what happens when your gas tank is full? It fills up, and there's a clicker on the nozzle that will automatically shut off the gas, so no more gas goes in your car when it's full, right? Now, our human body doesn't have a clicker like that, so we can sit down to a meal and load up on fuel, i.e., calories, and keep on eating it. Now, here's what happens from a metabolic perspective. I'm trying to explain this in ways that I think are functional and not too scientific, because although I'm a scientist, I like to communicate about these new discoveries in a way that I think makes sense to people who are wondering, like, so how does that apply to me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you're eating food. Your body is using some of that energy right away. When you eat food, your pancreas secretes a hormone called insulin. Insulin helps draw in energy so your cells have the power to do what it wants to do. It's like you're running onboard motor, okay? So you can keep on going on idle to do what you do. Anything else, basically your body takes and stores that extra, anything that is not immediately needed into fat. into those little fat cells. Remember, I told you those little fat cells started forming when you were in the womb around blood vessels. So that's where they start forming. Now, the energy that is the fuel that's stored in them, which is fat, fat is fuel, expands the fat cells. So they start tiny, but they can expand 100 times their size as they're filling up with fuel, like a water balloon. Okay. And because we don't have a clicker, if we keep on overloading our body with too much fuel, what happens in a car if the clicker didn't work? The gas tank would fill up, the gas would quickly overflow, run down the side of the car, run down around the wheels, pool around your feet, and start turning into this dangerous, toxic, flammable mess.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, in our body, you can't the extra fuel that we might overeat can't evaporate. So our body has to stuff it into fat cells. So imagine the normal fat cells get stuffed with fuel. They get bigger and bigger and bigger, 100 times bigger, and they stop. Oops, you got still some more fuel because you've overeaten. Okay, let's make some more fat cells. So it makes more fat cells, and then the body stuffs it up, blows it up 100 times in size. Oops, still have some more fuel. Let's make another fat cell, blows it up. And you can kind of see over and over, you do this, you wind up developing a bigger fat mass. Now, fat normally has absolutely critical functions in the body. Besides being a cushion, it's actually a space heater, and it can actually burn down fuel when we want it to. So fat can actually burn down fat when it's called into action. We'll talk about that. But the other thing that fat does is it's an organ. It's an organ like your heart, your lungs, your spleen. And that's an amazing thing because it's not just any organ. It's an endocrine organ, which means that it secretes hormones. More than 15 different hormones that fat has been discovered to secrete. And these hormones that normal healthy fat secretes are critical to run your metabolism so you have enough energy at all times. I'll just name 3 of them. One of them, people may have heard of, called leptin, Leptin. Leptin is sometimes referred to as a satiety hormone. People who don't know what satiety is, it's when you feel full. All right. Some people think it's like a switch off and on. I like people to think about this normal fat hormone made by your fat, healthy fat, actually as a volume control for your appetite. You have less leptin, volume controls goes up. Now you have more appetite. You have more leptin, your appetite kind of turns down. So it just kind of tunes it up and down. And like that's most hormones. It's kind of an up and down switch, not an on and off switch. Mm-hmm. Another hormone that's really important. Have you heard of a hormone called adiponectin?
Yeah. Okay.
So adiponectin, turns out, if I were to draw a vial of your blood as a doctor and send it to a hospital lab and say, hey, you know what, hospital lab, please measure all the hormones in Ari Witten's blood sample and tell me what they are. So they'd find adiponectin, but your levels of adiponectin would be 1,000 times higher than every other hormone in your body. Higher than testosterone, higher than thyroid hormone, higher than anything else. You know why? Because this fat hormone made by your normal healthy levels of fat that formed when you were in a womb, that's connected to your metabolism, adiponectin partners with insulin to make your energy extraction from your bloodstream more efficient. When your adiponectin goes up, your insulin works better. All right. And so that's an important gas pedal to allow our metabolism to use our energy. A third hormone, and then I'll stop, is resistin. If adiponectin is the gas pedal, so you absorb more energy more efficiently, resistin is the brake. If adiponectin goes, let's go get some more energy, the brake is the resistin goes, whoa, not so fast. Let's back off a little bit. So again, balance, harmony, control. It's a spectrum. It's like a volume switch on and off or a gas pedal brake kind of deal going on here. That's normal fat. But remember, I told you, if you overeat and your body has to stuff up more fat, it just fills up the gas tank and makes more tanks. All right. What happens is that as that fat mass expands, it outstrips its blood supply. It outstrips, and it has to start angiogenesis, blood vessels. We started talking about it at the very beginning. But the fat can grow much faster than blood vessels can grow to feed it. And so what happens, like a tumor, expanding mass, like a tumor, starts to rot in the middle. It's called hypoxia. It doesn't have enough oxygen. And without enough oxygen, what happens? This thing becomes highly inflammatory. So overeating grows your fat mass, causes your fat to be inflammatory, and especially when it's visceral fat, the kind of fat around your gut packed inside the tube of your body. That inflammation leaked out everywhere into your body. And now you become in a pro-inflammatory state, which we know sets up for chronic disease.
Okay, so everything you said just now is very compelling. However, we need to speak to, let's call them the skeptics. There are some people in the evidence-based source, I would say self-proclaimed evidence-based fitness and nutrition circles who strongly object to any discussion of quote unquote boosting one's metabolism. And there is a general sort of consensus in these groups that metabolism as defined by resting metabolic rate is generally not very malleable, meaning like dietary tweaks don't boost one's resting metabolic rate. There's also a lot of sort of debunking of the notion that one's resting metabolic rate declines dramatically during periods of caloric restriction. All this kind of stuff. There's another parallel area of research around metabolic adaptation that occurs during periods of underfeeding, caloric restriction, and how the body does make adaptations, usually that are not focused on one's resting metabolic rate, but things like how the nervous system innervates muscle tissue and will learn to be more efficient with accomplishing the same amount of activity and burn fewer calories to accomplish that activity, or to restrict the amount of fast twitch muscle fiber activation to restrict energy output, or to modulate non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the amount of energy that we expend at rest just moving around in our chairs, fidgeting our feet, and which amounts to hundreds of calories a day. So mainly the body seems to modulate those dimensions in order to change, to sort of try to match calorie output to calorie input. And again, this group challenges the notion that we can do a whole lot to change our resting metabolic rate, with the exception of maybe adding more muscle tissue to elevate it. So, and one more layer to this, which is the metabolic ward studies that have generally shown that that calories do matter, essentially, that at equivalent levels of calories, regardless of sort of the hormonal milieu with regards to insulin and that sort of thing, low carb versus high carb diets, at equivalent levels of calories, we lose the same amount of weight. So given those dimensions and sort of the perspective of that group of people, how would you explain what these physiological mechanisms, the modulation of inflammation and hormones and angiogenic factors and all those kinds of things that you're talking about, how is it actually linking up with the calories in, calories out equation to further drive weight loss?
All right. Okay. First of all, everything you said just now in explaining the perspective of the fitness community has basis in truth and is generally correct, except that I think that for most people, it's hard to really put that into terms that they would know what am I going to, so what does that mean for dinner tonight? Or how do I think about my day? And I think that for the aficionados, the people who are really deep diving, those are the ones that actually want to know all those nuances. I think that a couple of things, there's two big things I want to talk about that I think are going to bring maybe a little bit more dimension to the metabolism story that some people have heard of part of it and some people have not have heard of the other part. Okay, first of all, let's talk about metabolism as it actually changes during the day. Okay. As I mentioned, when we eat, it's like pulling over to the filling station. We're filling up during our waking hours when we're eating food, and insulin goes up and we're drawing in and storing energy, right? So that energy gets burned with whatever we need at the moment, and it's stored for later use. And in fact, while we're eating and while insulin is up, our metabolism naturally is focused on storing energy, not burning down energy, even though we need some to operate what we're doing. Now, when we're not eating, like when we're sleeping, all right, our insulin levels are down because we're not eating, insulin levels down. And what our metabolism does, it switches into a different gear where it actually is favoring energy burning. Let's go ahead and burn some energy. We're not loading up anymore. It's kind of like you turn your car off at the gas station, so you can load up your tank. You're not burning it down at the same time. Okay, so when you're sleeping, we're burning down energy, and we're burning it from the fuel tanks that were stored up during the day, and maybe the day before, and maybe the weekend before, and maybe the holidays. And really, sleeping, let's say you go to bed at 11 o'clock, and let's say you get up at 7. So you got 8 hours of sleeping. You got 8 hours of not eating. And so your body shifts towards that metabolic fat burning, energy, fuel burning state. And then you get up. And then when you get up and you start eating, you flip the metabolic switch, and you're doing something different. You're back in fuel storing mode. And so you can see net, basically, if you're not burning too many calories, you're not burning fuel, and you're loading up on fuels, that's calorie in versus calorie out, you're going to have an accumulation of fuel, extra fuel in your tank, which will increase the fat mass, which will then become pro-inflammatory, which can then derail all those hormonal functions we're talking about. So the current trend about intermittent fasting, which is which can be, a lot of people get confused about intermittent fasting as something that's new, that's been engineered to harness the body's activities. I like to think about it this way. It's one of the most natural things in the world. When we're sleeping or not eating, we're intermittently not eating, so we're intermittently fasting. And when we get up in the morning and we eat breakfast, we are breaking our fast. So we're intermittently eating and we're intermittently fasting. Not a big deal. But what happens is that we switch back and forth between and fuel burning versus fuel storing mode. Now, if you actually store more fuel continuously during the day, or if you don't actually allow your body to burn as much fuel during the night, like you eat really late at night. So it's not just what you eat and how much you eat, but it's also when you eat that can give your body more time to burn down fuel. That's one of the ways that our metabolism naturally starts to work. So again, rather than think about like a performance car, it's really about cycling up and down, like this harmonious balance of what our body naturally cycles to do. So it's very easy to overeat and very easy to actually grow extra body fat and load up too much fuel. Then you got to pay the price to kind of figure out how you're going to burn it down or burn it away. So I think fasting and eating are natural ways to explain this. And people have heard about intermittent fasting. What they may not have heard about is really the role of actually excess fat in affecting your metabolism in this way, because just 24 months ago, a landmark discovery was made by a scientist named Herman Ponzer, who worked with 90 other researchers from 20 countries, and they did the most ambitious study of human metabolism in history, which is they studied 6,000 people, men and women, different sexes, different ages, different locations, different body types across 20 countries. So you're really covering the gamut, okay? And they studied them exactly the same way for metabolism by giving them a drink of water. Now the water, water is H2O. Hydrogen is H, O is oxygen. And what they did is they tweaked the hydrogen and tweaked the oxygen chemically. It's called deuterated water. It's not radioactive, but you can measure it. And so when you give these 6,000 people the water to drink, you can measure how the metabolisms change the hydrogen and the oxygen in their breath, in their blood, and in their urine. And what they found, and by the way, one more thing, the 6,000 people that they studied, they range from 2 days old, beginning of life, to 94 years old, the very tail end of life. So this study, this is a landmark study. I mean, if you haven't seen it, you should read it. Covers the entire human lifespan, all right? And when they measured the metabolism, the initial results that came out, the raw data, showed the metabolism of these 6,000 people were, wait for it, all over the map. Not surprising, okay? Just like you expect. However, what they did, that was the turnkey tricky part, this is the brilliant part. They developed an algorithm that corrected on the basis of every subject's body size and the effect of excess body fat.
Mm.
on the metabolism. And they subtracted that using the algorithm individual by individual by individual by individual 6,000 times. And when they actually removed the effect on the metabolism of excess body fat, it was like uncloaking the statue of David. And it turns out that all humans go through the exact same 4 stages of metabolism over the course of human lifespan. Everyone's born with the same metabolism. From the first stage is from age 0 to 1. Metabolism skyrockets to 50% higher than your adult levels. Stage 1. Stage 2, from 1 year old to 20 years old, your metabolism goes down, 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 down to adult levels. That means that during adolescence, when kids are eating 2 dinners, they're going crazy with activity, and they're sprouting up like a beanstalk, their metabolism, like parents used to think, isn't going up, it's going down. Okay, it's hardwired. This is how we're hardwired. And then the big surprise is that from age 20 in phase 3, stage 3, 20 to 60, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, the human metabolism, as it's hardwired, is rock stable, does not change, does not go down when you reach your 40s or 50s or 60s, does not change because of childbirth, because of menopause, like hardwired. Doesn't change. And then at age 60, it goes down to 90, about 17%. What this means is that 60 can be the new 20 if you let your metabolism do what it wants to do. And then what they showed when you add the effect of body fat back. So we used to think that born with a slow metabolism, you're going to struggle with your weight. You're going to struggle with your food. You're going to be gaining weight and gaining body fat. Not so. Our hardwiring is just in those 4 phases. But if you add the effect of body fat, excess body fat, back into the system at any stage, you crush your metabolism. All right. So when you talk about
and that's crushing daily energy expenditure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Your hardwiring of how the fuel actually works, right? So this was not measured over. This was sort of like done in the experimental design. Isn't like studying an individual over time and finding out when they're racing and athletes versus people who are sedentary. But this is really kind of characterizing human metabolism over their life. So now there's a lot more to be studied to dive in there. But I can tell you that this discovery, which was published in the journal Science in 2021, completely upended the textbooks on human metabolism. Mm-hmm. It's not that the things that you said were incorrect. I acknowledge that actually they're all kind of based on, the details are actually all dimensions of how metabolism works. But we now know that it's not that you're born with a slow metabolism, which is why you struggle with your weight. It's actually that excess weight, excess body fat, impacts your metabolism to suppress it. And so this is not the idea of boosting your metabolism per se. It's really allowing your innate hardwired metabolism to rise to its own waterline.
Yeah, it's recovering what should be our normal, healthy metabolic state.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And remember, just like the angiogenesis story I told you, it's not that there's one, it's not like an EKG where you've got one level that's normal. It's a range. It's the Goldilocks zone. Metabolism goes up and down. You fidget a little bit more. It goes up a little bit more. You run to the grocery store. You run to the airport. It's going to burn a little bit more. It goes up and down. Okay. And so this idea of boosting metabolism, which is, kind of a marketing word, honestly, boosting, it's really allowing your innate hardwired metabolic operating system to actually escalate to a higher level within its normal plane. Okay. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about creating Superman versus hitting Superman with kryptonite. We're talking about actually optimizing within the zone of physiology. How do you optimize your own metabolism? So fighting body fat over the course of our lives, whether it's a child or in a middle age or adult, and also the behaviors that might make us gain weight at middle age. Think about it. Menopause, depression, you might be less active, you got children, you're worried about the economy, or, life slows down, life happens. And those factors can influence our decisions, and those decisions can involve not only how much we eat, overeating, overloading the fuel is not so helpful, but what we eat, and there are choices that actually help our body naturally grow more harmful body fat. that can actually sit on our metabolism. And so there is one caveat, though, to talk about boosting metabolism. And that is really, I would say, maybe not use the word boost, I would say activating our metabolism above what it normally does. And that this is something that, also you hear a lot in the fitness world, which is what is the role of brown fat?
Mhm.
And so, as it turns out, and I read about this in my new book, Eat to Beat Your Diet. The first part about this book is really what is the new science of the metabolism, and how do we rethink the role of body fat, and how do we understand what fat does for us when it's healthy, and what does it do against us when we have too much of it?
Mhm.
And with that type of knowledge, how is that connected to our health? And then what can we do to eat foods that will actually alter that? So the activation of fat is actually been scientifically studied with this particular kind of fat called brown fat, and I think it's worth talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So as let's present that piece of the story in a particular context. Okay, so if I can briefly summarize what you've described so far. And it's a brilliant way, sort of metaphorical way of explaining how the body works. I think it's a wonderful way for people to gain insight into what fat is all about and how it works and what we're doing when we're accumulating excess body fat, and then how that is poisoning the system. Now, at this point in the story, we've arrived at somewhat of a catch-22, somewhat of a people are in a pickle, so to speak, because the very people who need to lose weight, you're saying their metabolic health, their metabolism is being poisoned essentially by the fact that they have excess body fat. So, which is making it harder to lose body fat, right? So how do we escape that? And since we have to wrap up soon, maybe you can present this activating brown fat piece, and maybe a couple other practical tools that people can start to use to catalyze shifting their metabolism back into a healthy state.
Yeah, before we dive into brown fat, let me just kind of get into this by saying the brown fat is sort of like the icing on the cake approach, but there are some basic ways you can actually fight extra body fat. Start by having less fuel in your body. All right. So by avoiding the overconsumption of food, i.e., you're loading less fuel in your body, you'll actually start to create less body fat, less fuel tanks. So that's one important step. Second important step that's very practical is that you give your body, your own metabolism, more time to burn down fuel. And that's really the time that you are not eating. And that's the basis of intermittent fasting. Now, people talk about 16 and 8, of 16 fasting and 8 eating. 8-hour eating window can be pretty hard for many people to do. And 16 hours of fasting, I can do it, but not everyone feels comfortable doing it. But I'll tell you, the research even shows that even fasting 12 hours and eating 12 hours, if you don't overeat, is actually reasonable. You can actually lose body fat, fight body fat, and lose weight in that very way. And you want to extend that time to get 12 hours. Let's say you sleep for 8 hours from 11 to 7, 11 at night to 7 in the morning. It's 8 hours. Here's what you do. After you eat dinner at 7 o'clock the night before, let's say you put your dishes away at 8 o'clock. Don't snack. Don't eat late dessert. No noshing. So from 8 to 11, you just gain 3 extra hours to allow your body to burn down fuel. And when you get up in the morning, don't do what our mommies told us to do when we were kids, which is roll out of bed, eat breakfast, get on the school bus, and get to school. Here's what I do. I get up in the morning, I take a shower, I get dressed, I check my email, or I'll go for a walk or do something else. I don't eat breakfast right away for an hour, okay? And I've given myself an extra hour. 3 hours before sleeping, bedtime, 8 hours is 11 hours of sleep, 1 extra hour. Now I've done 12 hours right then and there. That's a little tip that's so easy for anyone to actually understand. Now you want to go for a deep cut, and you want to actually take a look at, and you got to avoid some of the fat fueling foods that can poison your microbiome and all that kind of stuff. Eat mostly plant-based foods, eat good healthy sources of protein. You do want to build your muscle more than build fat, all that kind of stuff. But you want a pro tip. You can actually start to activate your brown fat. It turns out body fat, which is normal and healthy, comes in 2 colors, white and brown. The white stuff is jiggly. It's under the arms, under the chin. It's the muffin top. It's on your thighs and your butt, stuff that most people don't want. And the white fat is also inside the tube of your body, which is the really dangerous visceral fat, visceral meaning gut. I would tell people to understand visceral fat can be in skinny people. And think about this image. It is like a baseball glove made of fat choking your organs.
Mm.
You need a little bit. When you have too much, it literally becomes inflamed and chokes your organs, which poisons your organs. And it's very dangerous. It disrupts all your metabolic hormonal signals. Okay, so brown fat is the other kind of color of fat. Why is brown? What is brown fat? Brown fat isn't wiggly and jiggly. Okay, it's not lumpy bumpy. It is wafer thin, paper thin, and it is not under the skin. You can't see it. It is layered close to the bone around your neck, under your breastbone, under your chest, around under your arms, like a bra strap, a little bit beyond your back, a little bit in your belly, and it is a space heater. And we know it's a space heater because that's why it's brown. It turns out that brown fat has a ton of mitochondria. Mitochondria are like the nuclear fuel cells of your body. They generate heat and they generate energy. When I was in med school, I used to memorize all kinds of stuff. Mitochondria, I used to call it mitochondria, because they actually are the fuel cells of our body. So it turns out that there are certain foods that you can actually eat that will trigger the mitochondria in brown fat. So they fire up and they generate heat. So brown fat is a space heater in your body. Now, in order to generate that heat, it needs energy, just like your space heater needs a plug, needs power in your wall. Or another way of thinking about the brown fat and the space heating thing, think about your gas range, your cooking stovetop, right? What do? You turn on the clicker, click, 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 whoosh, right? And that when you have the whoosh, where now you're going to cook on the flame, it's actually burning the flame. It's got to draw the energy from someplace, right? In your home on your stove, it's going to be your gas tanks, your gas tanks in your house or in your home. In your body, your brown fat, when it lights up with whoosh through the mitochondria, it draws that energy from your white fat, especially the visceral fat. So brown fat is good fat that can fight the bad fat, the extra bad fat, by burning it down. And so I write about in my book, Eat to Beat Your Diet, more than 150 foods that have human evidence, including the doses of actually foods that can actually light up your brown fat, and it burns fuel. So, do you want to say it's boosting metabolism? It's not like an energy drink, okay? What it's actually doing, it's actually firing up your consumption of fuel stored as calories. Now, what we're realizing is that in studies of food as medicine, that this can actually shrink visceral fat. This can actually temporarily improve your metabolism by a few points. Not huge, like we're not talking about 50%, but just enough to tip the balance where you're starting to burn fuel. And so although sleeping and not eating and fasting are the times when your body is inclined to burn fuel, that fuel burning mode, the exception is when you're eating foods food ingredients that can actually light up your brown fat and sort of shift the energy consumption or up the energy consumption along the way. The great news is that many of these foods are not, this isn't about deprivation. The thing I write about is that the good news is that these foods are the same ingredients that you would find in Mediterranean cuisine or Asian cuisine. Many of them these are the two healthiest cuisines on the planet. And most people could find something delicious to eat in it. And so I kind of talk about this idea that, we don't need to fear our food. We shouldn't fear our food. We shouldn't get fixated on counting numbers and counting calories. We should really lean into our food and really learn to love our food in order to harness and tame our metabolism, our body fat, so that we can not only align the enjoyment of that very human nature of having food for pleasure, along with having better health and better metabolism.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple quick points. You probably learned this, if you didn't already know it, in the process of writing about brown fat, but it was thought for many years in the scientific community that adult humans did not have brown fat tissue. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, well, it's wrong, and it's because it's
Right.
been discovered that adults do have it. Now, I'll give you in my book, I write about the interesting history of brown fat, which dates back to the 17th century when a naturalist named Conrad Gessner was dissecting the alpine marmot, which is the little squirrel-like thing that was hibernating. And he found in between his shoulder blades this little lump of brown, eraser-like looking thing. Didn't know what it was, and he called it a hibernoma because it was like in a hibernating animal, and it was a homa, which is like a mass, right? And like a hibernoma is just a mass that was found in hibernating animals. Fast forward, and people started finding it in all kinds of other hibernating animals. Fast forward to the mid 1900s, a scientist at UCLA, a physiologist, actually at that point had the microscopes that could actually take a deeper look at this fat mass, this brown stuff, and what they saw was that, oh my gosh, this is actually body fat.
Mm-hmm.
This is a brown piece of body fat, and when they started to look, it's found in hibernating animals. It must help them keep warm, right? So that's when they found the mitochondria and the heat generating function, and they were wondering if it's in animals, is it in people? So the first place they looked at in babies, and in
Mm-hmm.
fact, there is brown fat between the shoulder blades of babies, just like in the mammal, the alpine marmot that was dissected in the 17th century. And
Mm-hmm.
then it seems to kind of go away. All
Right.
right. And that's why people are like, you know what? This is a vestigial thing. It's
Yeah,
like tonsils or your appendix. Don't worry about it.
exactly.
Oh, totally wrong. So the
Yeah.
real story is that it got discovered back in the like around 2009. There was a woman that came into a hospital in Boston with a tumor in her chest. And at the time, they had PET scans, which detect metabolism. It's like, a CT scan or MRI looks at the structure of the body. PET scan doesn't give you structure, it gives you metabolism. And so we use it to measure tumors and hearts to look for how much energy is being consumed, generated by it. And tumors are light up. So this woman with a tumor in her chest got a PET scan, and guess what? The thing in her chest lit up like a firework.
Mm.
Okay. And so then they biopsied it, and they took it out the biopsy and looked under the microscope. Now, very sophisticated microscope. Guess what? Not a cancer. It
Mm-hmm.
was not a cancer. It was a hibernoma. Okay. It was a piece of brown fat that was a tumor. And so one of the researchers, Ronald Kahn, who's an endocrinologist, I wonder if other PET scans are showing these hibernomas. We just missed them. Maybe, like the radiologist didn't just blew it off because it looked like a little thing lighting up someplace, but we weren't looking for them because they weren't where the cancer was or the heart or whatever. And he went back and looked at 1,000 PET scans from patients that had been studied in the hospital, and he found, some of them had them and some of them didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Classic scientist dilemma. So, is it just BS? Is it just an artifact? What is it? Then he thought about it, and this is the mark of a really brilliant scientist. He said, you know, originally brown fat was found in hibernating animals who are cold. So
Yeah.
he checked the weather forecast, and he correlated the temperature, the weather forecast that was taken on the day of these 1,000 patients who got their PET scan, and he
Very smart.
found
Yeah.
that in warm weather in the summer, that would hardly picked up anything,
Uh-huh.
but all the brown fat was picked up in the bodies in these PET scans during the winter months. Now, where did they find it? Just what I told you, around the neck, in the chest, packed in the belly. And I actually, because you sort of need to see this to believe it, I actually got permission from the researchers to put the actual pictures of the brown fat lighting up in my book, Eat to Beat Your Diet, because I want
Very
people to
cool.
see there's a lot of brown fat in adults. You
Right.
got to see it to believe it.
Now, it atrophies a lot in most unhealthy adults who are not regularly exposing themselves to the cold. Is that correct? And do you know if it's, I mean, what you just described about the summer versus winter months is very interesting, and that suggests that there's a seasonal atrophy and a seasonal regain of that tissue. But I guess two quick questions to wrap up. One is it possible in somebody who has very atrophied brown fat tissue to stimulate the formation or the synthesis of more brown fat tissue from nutrients alone, or does it require regular cold exposure? And did you find any research to suggest a synergy between using some of these nutrients from food combined with regular cold exposure?
Yeah. So the whole idea of cold exposure is that definitely activates and kind of and exercises your brown fat. You have more hypertrophy or more development of brown fat. By the way, they saw this in the Scandinavian outdoor workers. People who are working outdoors in Scandinavian, lumberjacks and such, much more brown fat because they're outside all the time.
Right.
And by the way, so what is this fat trying to do? Probably try to keep core body temperatures up a little bit, right? It makes total sense that this would actually exist. As opposed to atrophy, it is true that there is sort of a decline in the amount of brown fat with aging, but it turns out that you can actually bring it back. And studies have been done by understanding the mechanisms of this. And I don't know if we have the time to really dive into all the details of the mechanism, but we understand that cold temperatures, okay, stimulates norepinephrine, which is kind of a stress hormone. And stress hormone goes down from our brain, released from our brain, goes down the nerves to the brown fat, and it turns on the brown fat. It fires it up. It's like putting a long matchstick into the gas burner when your clicker is not working. Whoosh, you get it going. All right. It turns out, however, cold temperature isn't the only thing that can trigger the norepinephrine. And by the way, that norepinephrine activates the beta-3 adrenergic receptor, which then there's a domino effect. Okay, the beta-3 adrenergic receptor on brown fat goes down to the mitochondria in the cell of a fat cell, which then has something called UCP1, uncoupling protein 1. That's basically like a trigger, like on a pistol. When you press that trigger, boom, you light up that mitochondria, that nuclear reactor, and you start the brown fat. So what's interesting is to ask, well, what else can stimulate this pain? And it turns out that there are drugs. In fact, there's a drug called mirabegron that's approved for treating bladder spasm that specifically activates the beta-3 adrenergic receptor, and which then activates the uncoupling protein 1, which then activates the mitochondria, which then fires up your brown fat. And clinical studies have been done at the National Institutes of Health showing that mirabegron at much higher doses than you'd safely give for bladder spasm actually will light up all that brown fat. Okay, so number one, we know that pharmaceuticals can actually do it, and the future of fat management isn't going to be like the Wegovy's and Ozempics and stuff like that. I mean, really, it's probably going to be figuring out how to manipulate these very, very fine, detailed pathways. But until that time, it turns out that foods can also trigger the same pathways. So chili peppers. Turns out if you have chili flakes, the stuff you put on your pizza, you get that zing or hot sauce. The buffalo wings. The capsaicin in chili peppers is a bioactive, binds to the receptor on your tongue. And again, not to confuse people, but we know the names of these things. TRPV1. Okay, it's a transit receptor of vanilloid peptide 1. I gave very simple examples earlier about the car and the driver. I want you to know, as a scientist, like we can go there and like really dig down into the mechanisms, but I think it's hard for people to understand and keep track of. But when you put the hot chili pepper flake on your tongue, it basically is like putting a key into a lock and turning the switch. Your tongue sends a text message as a signal to your brain to release two things. One, endorphins. This was why some people feel good hormones, which is why some people really love chili peppers, are kind of addicted. The second thing it triggers your brain to release, norepinephrine. And so you can feel this in a quiet room. If you were to actually eat something spicy in a room and you turn off the lights, so you're just paying attention to yourself, put yourself in a Zen state, you eat that chili pepper, you will literally feel the nerves lighting up in your head, down your neck, and lighting up your brown fat. It's really amazing. Try that next time you're having something spicy. Just close your eyes and pay attention to your body. You feel it lighting up. Beta adrenergic receptor activated by the norepinephrine, lights up UCP1, turns on the mitochondria. Boom, you've actually turned on your brown fat. This has been studied specifically. Brown fat lights up, burns fuel, draws it from harmful white fat, and now you've elevated your metabolism within the normal range, okay, towards the upper level of normal, and you're starting to consume energy, consume fuel, and you burn down and you start to shrink body fat. And you'll lose weight, you'll actually shrink your waistline, actually, and you'll improve your other metabolic parameters, like insulin resistance will start to recede, reverse in some cases, and your fat mass will also decline as well. So chili peppers is just one example of the 149 other foods I actually talk about in my new book.
Dr. Lee, this has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Are there any final words you want to leave people with, and tell people when and where they should get your new book?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to tell people maybe you can tell this from the tone of my voice. I'm a scientist and a doctor, but I'm super excited about these new sets of discoveries that really put the power of metabolism back into our hands, and where we don't have to fear our food. We can actually intelligently approach our food in ways that can activate our own natural systems to fight body fat, improve our metabolism, and elevate our health overall. This is really a sea change from how we used to think and about body fat, and kind of fear it and fear food, and think that metabolism is our destiny. It is our destiny in the sense that we're hardwired with this operating system, but we can actually play with our systems in order to be able to amplify the good parts of it too, so we can rise to its own natural level. And so I think that my overall kind of like parting words is that, you can love your food, to love your metabolism, to love your health. My new book comes out on March 21st, available anywhere where books are sold. I'd love to have people check it out and give me feedback. I love to hear about this. This is a growing area of research. This stuff is, some of the stuff is so new that the old textbooks on metabolism are being rewritten, and they haven't even come out yet. So we're really talking about an inflection point, I think, in terms of thinking about human metabolism energy.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next